Okay, so today's speakers, our main guest today, as part of this presentation or this discussion on publication metrics, is Jonathan Lee. So Jonathan is a senior manager of regional publications and covering growth and emerging markets at Takeda Pharmaceuticals International, based in Singapore. John is also a APAC trustee with ISMPP as part of the board of trustees. And before moving into pharma industry, John had over 5 years experience working as a MedComms professional in agency side, and John has a PhD in stem cell biology and regenerative medicine from the National University of Singapore. So thank you, Jonathan, for joining us today to be part of this panel. It's great to have you on board for this. And then we have Blair and myself, that you should be familiar with from previous meetings. So Blair is a principal consultant with First in Human in New Zealand, and myself, communications director at Oxford PharmaGenesis in Australia. Briefly, these are the learning objectives that we've proposed for today's session. So we are going to review the strengths and the weaknesses of commonly used metrics. And we're going to have a little bit of a focus on metrics in Asia Pacific, and consider how we can potentially, if we can, prospectively assess the impact of publishing data in our region. And just a quick disclaimer, I'm going to ask Jonathan to talk about, when we are, the basic question, we're talking about publication metrics. What are the key things that we're actually talking about, Jonathan?
All right. Thanks very much, Steven. And, great to be part of this. Thank you for the invitation. Great to see everyone on board. Before I get into this, I want to keep this free flowing as well. So if there are any questions along the way, just drop them in the chat, and happy to pause and kind of address them as we go. So before we can really start talking about metrics, I think we just need to kind of get aligned on some of the terminology that we may use. And I want to acknowledge Tom Rees from Oxford PharmaGenesis, who helped to put these slides together and presented them at the ISMPP annual meeting this year. And I was part of the session there. So the key things we kind of need to differentiate, right? Firstly, when we're talking about publication metrics, reach refers to how many people have seen a publication. Seeing is one thing, but then we have next readership, which is, whether you've read the publication or not, which has implications perhaps for open access. Thirdly is activation. So if you've read the publication, what are you doing with it after that? Have you interacted with it? Have you talked about it? Have you shared it? Have you spoken about it or discussed the content with anyone else or your peers? And lastly, I think the one thing that we're all really looking for as the gold standard is the impact the publication has on clinical practice. And this is probably the hardest thing to measure. So as you can see, as we're moving down, the level of engagement increases, but the ability to kind of get a metric for that becomes increasingly nebulous. If we can move to the next slide, please. So zooming into each of these a little bit more, what do we mean when we're talking about reach, readership, interactions, impact? I think when we're talking about reach, we're looking at, where the publication goes, how it's being found, who is able to view it. So your congress strategy, your journal selection, journal features, maybe some search engine optimization, and keywords, all these things, maybe QR codes as well. This helps to cast your net really, really wide to make sure that you have as much reach as possible, because a very common question that will come up from our authors is, we want to go publish high impact, but at the end of the day, what's more important, to have your paper read or to have it published in a really high impact factor journal that no one ever sees again, right? The next thing is how you're engaging your readers. I mean, with your abstract, if they see your abstract, is there anything that's going to motivate them to want to read the rest of the article, right? So very often we have publication extenders, we have graphical abstracts that help to become this hook to entice viewers to become readers, right? And by getting them to read it, then you are really making sure that it's the next level of your data dissemination, right? And that having disseminated the data, having gotten them to read the information, what happens then, right? Are they then talking about this further? Are they sharing this? Are they somehow incorporating this into their own practice? So very often we turn to social media and multi-channel, engagement as a surrogate to see what's happening. It may be there are differing opinions on how good a surrogate this is. We're going to talk about that a bit later on. But at the end of the day, as we alluded to, what we want to see is the data getting incorporated and influencing clinical practice guidelines, expert consensus, making positive impacts on patients, whether it's, supporting reimbursement for a new drug or, helping to improve quality of life or patient outcomes. And that, as you can imagine, will take a lot longer to kind of materialize. So that's why we're always looking at all these other surrogates at the beginning. If we can move to the next slide. Right, so activation to maximize impact. You can see there's kind of like two phases, right? The first one is the initial publication, amplification, and reach. You use all these various channels to get that first peak. And then subsequently, as people start to read and interact, you may get Wikipedia updates, you may get journal podcasts, depending on how you work with the publishers. And then further down the line, you start to get citations, right? Which is where impact factor measurements come in. And these start to become medical impact metrics, right? So it's really this very specific two phases that we see. And the current school of thought is if we can make sure that the first peak is as big as possible, that should, in theory, translate into, better peaks down the line over time. Whether that actually works, we're still trying to figure that out. And last slide. Right, so some thoughts about tracking and using metrics. I think journals are increasingly providing different types of metrics for everyone to use. And depending on what your strategy is, I think that may help to feed into how you have your publication strategy, the types of journals you want to target, and kind of the discussions you need to have, whether you're on the agency side or the client side, what is your plan to disseminate this data, right? Article level metrics as opposed to journal level metrics. So impact factor would be a journal level metric because it only tells you about the journal. But article level metrics would be viewership rates, alt metrics, because they tell you specifically what's happening for the article. I think article metrics will help to contextualize impact during planning and process, but they're not a one size fits all, as we'll see in the discussions later, right? So it's really a case of understanding and leveraging the interactive and impact metrics, understanding what your baseline is to then expand and enhance your engagements. And you really want to think about metrics not as this one standalone, this golden cow that we all want to get, but rather just one part of the larger medical communications dissemination plan. So I'm just going to stop there and hand it back to Steve to take us into some of the discussions.
So perhaps we can unpack some of what you've just gone through there and go into a bit more detail around some of it. What do you see as some of the strengths and the weaknesses of those different metrics that you just talked about?
So, as I alluded to, I think they're all surrogates, right? They're not going to tell us exactly what we want to know, whether this publication is going to have that final impact in clinical publication guidelines. We're really making the assumption that if we're getting X number of views, it means people are reading the data, and hopefully they then go on to use it in the way we're hoping that, it to support patient care. But the reality is from my own experience, some of the data I've been collecting within my role is baseline numbers are going to vary very greatly. I think a lot of the work that we see and a lot of the discussion we have on the global stage really focuses on metrics for clinical trial publications, so phase 3, phase 2Bs, which generate a lot of interest. But when we come to real world evidence, at the regional setting, HEOR publications, there's no talk about this because it doesn't generate the same interest. You don't get the same, impressive view numbers, or it doesn't get accepted in the same fancy high impact journals. So there's a bit of a gap there. And to really try and understand what's happening, I think the biggest challenge is to start gathering longitudinal data. Very often we look at it as a cross-section point in time. Oh, okay, it's been viewed maybe, 400 times, 500 times. But what does that mean overall? And I don't think we have, or I'd encourage everyone to start thinking about how you collect this data over time, whether you're from the pharma side or whether you're from the agency side or freelancer, because this longitudinal data is really what's going to be more insightful for everyone. And until we as a community can kind of figure out what's happening there, it's going to be hard to make any extrapolation beyond that. And lastly, it's going to vary between therapy areas as well. I mean, the metrics you get for oncology are going to be vastly different from maybe hemophilia A, which would be vastly different from something else, or maybe a vaccine paper. So again, you kind of need to differentiate that as you go through.
Thanks, Johnny. That's really interesting. The idea of monitoring the effect of your publication prospectively. Blair, did you have any thoughts around generally the metrics discussion and some of the easily available journal metrics, such as old metric that we see a bit?
Well, I think what we're talking about there is exactly what John's talking about, is that challenge of longitudinally managing things, because I think so many of our metrics are very short term, and it's measuring perhaps what's happening in the month or 2 months after we get that big hit of maybe there's a Congress presentation, or there's the journal's pushing stuff out on social media, the authors are pushing stuff out on social media, or there's some sort of press coverage. And so on one hand, you get a lot of those. I think a lot of those views are front-loaded. We don't necessarily see, like John was mentioning, whether or not views translate into readers and whether that readership translates into citations, which are inevitably going to be a year or two down the track. And I think a year or two down the track, clients have generally forgotten about what looking back to a year or two ago and saying, well, was what we did a year or two ago effective, and did that translate into anything? There's that sugar rush of, hey, look, we've got, in particular, I think some of the marketing that almost comes with this is we all log in, we look at maybe our own papers or papers that we're downloading as part of our work, and we see this big, colourful wheel of alt metrics in it, and we go, oh, wow, look, this one's got a really high number and it's been in various places, and sometimes there are elements in that old metric score or readership or whatever where we can't. Some of it's got a higher weighting than others. Some of it I think can be somewhat artificial because we can pump up tweet numbers all we like. I mean, if you really wanted to go down the path of using bots or whatever, I mean, and I think anybody who's got a Twitter account will know that you encounter bots who like your stuff and give you an artificial reading of that. But then I think some of the value that isn't captured in some of those metrics is people who are, say, saving, as John sort of mentioned about citations, like people who use Mendeley or something like that, who are saving down your paper and putting it on file for perhaps citation at a later date. It's captured as a part of the alt metrics, but it's not actually adding to the number or anything like that. And particularly, as I've just put in the chat earlier, just in an offline discussion that we were having before that we started with this, is from an APAC perspective as well, some of the channels that are perhaps being used to develop this impact are not picked up by some of the perhaps more metrics that have been developed for a North American or European audience, where we're talking Facebook, we're talking X or Twitter or English language news versus what might be happening on WeChat or other channels that is where the impact might be felt. So I think there's a really interesting sort of element to that, of that what John's talking about with the longitudinal side of things, and that how do we almost plan for extended coverage of our metrics, and have a plan to take the learnings from that and look backwards.
And just building on that, I mean, since we've got a very interesting team here, as Blair has mentioned, very often the client side may sometimes think, oh, we've got the publication endpoint, right? But we know in MedComms that the publication is really the starting point. And I think one of the challenges is really getting the client cross-functional team to really think about this as, once we have the publication, it's not the endpoint. What is your plan for that? How are you going to generate your medical communication materials? What is your dissemination plan for that? And as you are making this plan, you actively need to deliberately build in metrics at each step of the way, right? If our goal for this HEOR publication is to support reimbursement in, this one particular country, right? Then what is our endpoint? Our goal then is to make sure success for us for this publication means it gets published on time, it gets submitted with the submission dossier, or it's part of the negotiation process, and then we get that final reimbursement. That's why HEOR paper. If we have an RWE paper that talks about maybe quality of life for patients, what is the metric of success there, right? For us, it could be maybe we want to make sure that patients are now able to see this information so they can better understand the implications of choosing one treatment over the other. So then the measure you use may then skew more towards looking at social media channels, and even your dissemination and communication plan may skew towards that. And with Asia Pacific budgets, then you might be able to make a case that it would be really important to have maybe a graphical abstract or plain language summary, or even translations of this abstract for this publication, so that we can expand reach to more patients in the region. Right, so that's how you really want to start thinking about this as a full continuum, and thinking about how you can measure, how you define success, and then how you're going to measure success for each of those different scenarios that you have for a publication.
Thanks. I think that's a good point there around touching on publication enhancements, if you like. So like graphical abstracts and so forth, you've just mentioned, John. So if we think about that a little bit more, I mean, there's certainly been a lot of talk, as you say, traditionally we consider our baseline around publication metrics, the sort of modern work that's been done around measuring it and publishing some of the some publications that are sort of prospectively monitoring metrics, combining those three concepts of reach, engagement, and impact. In the Asia Pacific region, that's potentially a bit of a harder thing, because we think about the social media channels that are used in Asia Pacific are different. The way Asia Pacific is a very unique environment. There's lots of different cultures and languages. How do we know about how much appetite healthcare professionals in the Asia Pacific region have to consume things like, consume their data, if you like, with things like graphical abstracts, publication enhancements, plain language summaries, and indeed, do we actually think that our clients, if we are working with clients in the Asia region, do they have an appetite to actually invest more into developing some of those publication enhancements that might support their audiences? Do you have any thoughts around that, Blair? Start.
I think, well, there's a couple of questions in there. I think having seen how local clients have functioned at times, I think often they actually do compare with perhaps what I've encountered maybe more, say, a global level. There has been a focus on the purpose of this paper. Our measurement of success is we want to see this in guidelines, but often that's because they're not looking at at the local environment. They're looking at, we want to see this in North American guidelines to drive our main market, which is North America. In other ways, I think there's an element of, as we were discussing earlier, in certain jurisdictions, you need that paper across the line to get approval in Japan or approval in China or something like that. So the measure of success there is perhaps something different. On the graphical abstract publication extender side of things, we've done a bit of research into this, and we've been looking into it quite deeply. And I think that's as good as the product that is delivered by the journal. We've just waded through, actually it was only about 60 graphical abstracts, but when there's poor resolution, and looking into the literature on this, a lot of it is it drives impact in terms of, you could say, yes, it drives metrics such as increased viewership or readership, but there's sort of conflicting results about whether or not that will actually result in the same sort of longer term benefit of increased citation. And then even like adding something like a video, how effective that is, I think the jury's out on that, because if you've got various different channels that you're trying to reach people with different messages and slightly different things, do people bother? Do you pick up in those metrics that people have actually read things if they decide, I'm just going to watch this video instead? And again, those metrics, I think, can be confounded by how many internal people are jumping on, reading, viewing multiple times, how many medical writers have gone back to the same journal article 3 or 4 times to read it or download it or something like that. So I think there's very much there's going to be consideration, I think, in terms of what you're trying to measure. And I actually find it interesting that it's been the local clients that I think I've interacted with the most who've had more longer-term measures of success that they are looking for from their manuscript. And they're going, oh, well, that's great that we've got X number of reviews that have happened after we've released this. But ultimately, if we don't get that guideline inclusion, we don't get that approval, or we don't get that reimbursement, that's not going to matter. So that's just my experience on that front.
Yeah. And from my side, I think we do need to also be aware, first of all, that regionally, we don't see as many phase 3 publications, right? So you're not going to get all these very sexy manuscripts coming out that all the journals are itching to get their hands on, right? It's going to be RWE, real world data, real world evidence, not as popular. Regional journals may not always be set up to provide metrics as well, and their own reach is going to be a bit different. Depends also on the target audience, because I think if we take China, for example, or Japan, if you publish in local language, you may actually get more pickup, more readership. But are you able to kind of measure that? That's a question we need to ask ourselves, because again, the entire publishing field is still skewed towards the English-speaking majority. So I think that's one of the considerations we have. I think when we are discussing, the second question about budgets and how we can kind of have this discussion, I think Hazel's put in a very good comment as well. Budgets remain a challenge for us in the Asia-Pacific region. So I think this is where the metrics come into play as well. If you are collecting your longitudinal metrics, then the idea that it's forward-thinking, right? Collect the metrics to show the success of this, therefore you can justify the budget for the next project. I do have back-to-back metrics, that show that open access, even for regional publications, does make a difference, because we do see much higher viewership. Assumption is that viewership is going to translate into something. In terms of citations, when I've tried looking at data, citations can take anywhere from 6 months to a year, maybe even 2 years to accumulate. And for regional data, when we're talking citations, you're thinking maybe, 3, 4, if you're lucky. Maybe you get 1 citation in the first year. So very different from what you'd see from a phase 3 clinical trial. So I think there's a need to really be aware of the limitations of citation as a final metric for us, and really have that conversation with clients and the authors, because appealing to the values, I think it's more important to highlight that the priority for all of us as publication professionals is to make sure that data gets disseminated in a timely manner, right, to the right audience. Yes, it's great you want to aim high. Yes, I know that, there may be certain pressures from your work that you have your own internal metrics to meet. But I always try and frame the discussion of my teams as, look, it's important data. We all acknowledge this is important data. We want to get it out quickly. So yes, you can go ahead and the authors can choose, this high impact factor journal. Reality is you're probably going to get rejected 3, 4, 5 times, and the longer you wait, the harder it is to get accepted. Or we can aim a bit lower, but we can show you these other metrics that are a good surrogate, and maybe these will help to convince the authors and kind of slowly, I think, shift the wider discussion away from impact factor all the time to really effective dissemination of data to make a difference for patients.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges we have with a lot of the publications in Asia-Pac as well. If we're doing subgroup analyses or like you say, real-world evidence, they're often articles that are perhaps not going to have a lot of follow-up, and therefore that's going to limit citation opportunities. Yeah, it's fulfilling a need, but there's not necessarily a pathway. I think with a lot of the work that we do in Asia-Pac, there's going to be heaps of follow-on work which is going to generate, and that's again going back to the measures of outcomes and what people are trying to often achieve is that very specific outcome which may not be captured in traditional metrics that we've relied upon for years.
Yeah, and that remains the biggest gap because I think in the region, even globally, not enough people are thinking about metrics in this kind of this all holistic approach. It's always publication metric, full stop. Manuscript published, full stop. Right, but it has to go right across the spectrum of medical functions and your entire communication plan. And that probably remains the biggest challenge to anyone, try and get everyone together, get aligned on, what works for us and how can we track this over time. I think that the time piece is also the critical aspect.
So you just, again, John, you touched on the idea of prospectively assessing the impact of a publication with longitudinal data. How do you have any final thoughts around whether it's possible? What's the low-hanging fruit, if you like, for doing this in the Asia Pacific region so that we can get a better understanding of the impact of our publications, regional publications?
So I think the lowest hanging fruit is just collecting views and download data, right? I mean, Blair's already alluded to this. Alt metrics don't really work for us. I tried collecting that, and sometimes the highest score I see is like a 7 because maybe it got picked up on one news network, but otherwise you get maybe 3s or 4s, and it has no value for us. Views and downloads, not ideal. They're a very loose surrogate, but it's a starting point. And I think from my initial experiences sharing this information with my internal teams, for them it's eye-opening because we can finally see, this is a number we can attach to this publication. Yes, there are a lot of caveats and limitations to that number. So as MedComms professionals, I think it's about choosing the message you want to communicate with any data that you share. And you want to tune that, whether it's going to a medical function or whether it's going to a commercial function. But starting to socialize that we can get quantitative data, which perhaps our commercial colleagues may be more familiar with or better understand, versus the traditional or medical, we always have qualitative outputs. It's very hard to put a number to the things that we do, right? And also, I think addressing Hazel's comment in the chat, thank you for that, Hazel. Yes, I think we also need to be very selective in what we do, right? Because we have to do more with less. And it comes back to what our publication strategy or what our communication strategy is. If we know that something's just a routine thing, we need to publish a PMS study, then go ahead, do that. Maybe don't collect the metrics, right? But if you know something is going to be a bit more important, we want to make sure we get data to support, future use cases for that, then plan to start collecting the metrics. But I think the key thing is for everyone to really just start collecting metrics. Right. I have a team that helps me on a monthly basis, just go through the list of all the publications that I have and just quickly pull viewership data from all the journal websites manually. Right. If you put in the hyperlinks, it's a quick thing. You click, you copy the number, you're done. from ISMPP discussions, publishers are also happy to provide more detailed metrics if you engage with them ahead of time. And that's something also that we can start to consider in the region, because it's not something that's talked about enough.
I think that's a really good point, Jonathan. Isn't it? I mean, one also needs to consider the logistics, the basic things about how you actually get the data. It's not always obvious. Not all journals actually put their number of downloads of a paper on right next to the article on the website. You might have to dig or inquire with them directly about getting those data on your publications. So it is actually potentially some commitment is required to continually collect data longitudinally.
You can reach out to the journal publishers or the journal editors. I think normally the publisher point of contact is going to be a bit more knowledgeable rather than the chief editor. And once you start having those discussions, they can probably point you to the necessary teams.
Yeah, that was something that came up at ISMPP, wasn't it? That when you were giving your presentation there, John, that the publishers were like, "Oh yeah, we've got this data, but
no one's ever asked us for it." Yeah, if you want it, just ask. Which I think for many of us, like, oh really? Because it's kind of, I guess it's the lesson of you don't know unless you ask, and the worst that can happen is that they say, "No, sorry, we don't have that information, or we won't give it to you." But that's adding value for if you're an agency writer, or I guess internally in pharma as well. It's adding value to be able to say, well, I tried at least, or hey, guess what? I managed to be able to get some of this data that the person who hasn't made that effort doesn't have. So beneficial just to try. And that feeds back into your publication strategy. Do you want to submit to a journal that may not provide metrics, or do you want to start selecting journals that do provide metrics so you can have this feedback and then continue to use that, right? It's part of the discussion and considerations.